So I've done a lot of different kind of projects, and I have done a lot of projects related to the ocean, and have more recently, but like really the ocean more in terms of thinking about infrastructure and thinking about geopolitics and thinking about just how the world is actually constituted, both environmentally but also politically. And I think, as Jonathan mentioned, we sometimes think of the ocean as this kind of blank space, this kind of great nothing, but nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, political theorists have thought about this, and in terms of like at least military theory, one of the great thinkers is Alfred T. Mahan, who wrote a book in 1890 called "The Influence of Sea Power Upon History." And the thesis of the book was that whoever controlled the seas controlled the world, right? The top level of the seas, at least. But the idea was that whoever controlled the seas controlled the world, because what you could do if you controlled the seas was that you got to decide who was able to go where, what kinds of goods were able to move around the world, and you could get information about who got to move what around the world. And effectively, you could control the world by controlling the sea lanes. And he was saying this is how this could explain why a small nation like Great Britain could become a global empire. And they became a global empire through their strong navy. And we fast forward this to more recent times. And this is a map that is from the archive that Edward Snowden provided to some journalists who are friends of mine. And this is a project that I worked on a little bit. And I think this is really one of the more remarkable documents of the 21st century so far. This is an NSA map showing the what global telecommunications infrastructures looks like. And what you see from a map like this is a couple of things. First of all, you see that the humans have wrapped, encircled the planet with cables, right? Almost like a Christo sculpture, something like that. We've draped cables all across the world. The other thing that you see is that these cables more or less roughly correspond to old colonial shipping routes, right? A third thing that when you know something about these cables that inhabit the world's oceans, about 99% of the data that travels over electronic networks travels under the oceans, through the depths of the oceans, among the strange sea creatures and luminescent beings that live down there. The oceans, in a very real way, are responsible for the internet. They're responsible for global telecommunications, for global logistics, telephones. Cloud computing is actually in the sea. Obviously, storage and so on and so forth. Facebook, Instagram, and Google, artificial intelligence and self-driving cars. All of this is happening also in the oceans, and I mean that quite literally, because this data is traversing these cables. And I think that this is a corollary to the last image that we looked at. This is kind of an even more remarkable image, which is this is a map of how the American National Security Agency projects power across these infrastructures. How do you control global telecommunications infrastructures in a way that might be analogous to the ways that the British Navy controlled the seas in the 19th century? And this is a map, again, from the Edward Snowden archives that shows you exactly how they do that. And when you see these, one of the more important parts of this map is you see all these cables connecting the continents together, going underseas, and you see these blue dots. And where those blue dots are places that are called choke points. And they're places where fiber optic cables that are draped across the ocean floor come together and come on land. So they're places where there's the interface between the cables underwater and terrestrial infrastructures. And these are very important places to control if you are a military agency that wants to be able to tap all the communications in the world, because they're places where you can relatively efficiently kind of monitor all of the information moving across the world in small amounts of space. And these are beaches. These are interfaces between the water and the shore. And one project I've done for a number of years is just going to these places where these convergences of cables coming on shore and photographing those places. But obviously, there's nothing to see there because these convergences will be under the water and under the beaches themselves. And so I've been making maps that are paired with these images, and these maps are kind of collages of images that all speak to what's going on in the photograph, but that are also but that are invisible in the photograph at the same time. This is a place in Hawaii, a place in northern Germany. Marseille, France is a very important place to global telecommunications infrastructure because all of the internet cables coming from India and from the Middle East come and go up through the Red Sea across the Mediterranean and land in Marseille, and that's where they join the continental European infrastructures. So I was taking these kind of photographs and then thinking about, well, the rules of these photographs was that I kind of pretty precisely figured out how to have these so-called choke points in the frames of the images. But then I thought, let's take this a little bit further. And I learned how to scuba dive and started traveling around the world and trying to find places on the floor of the ocean, not nearly, not 7,000 meters deep or what have you, but in diveable conditions where you would look at the bathymetry of the ocean floor, look at the structure of the ocean floor, try to find places where these cables should be visible, right, where they should have to emerge from the sand because there would be a reef or something like that. And going out and doing basically low budget underwater exploration, bringing out search teams and trying to find these things. And unfortunately, these images are very dark and it's still pretty bright outside, so they're kind of hard to see. But this image is a cable called Columbus 3, which connects the east coast of the United States to Lisbon. This is a cable called Americas 2, which you can kind of see in the bottom right, which connects the U.S. to Brazil. This is one that connects the U.S. to the Bahamas. And this kind of brings me to this interface between data going underwater and telecommunications infrastructures and some of the work that I've been doing more recently as well, which is that this I've spent a lot of time just trying to map out these infrastructures, try to see them, try to think about how does this make us think about the ocean differently? How does this make us think about the internet differently? How does it make us think about communications differently? But I feel like the more recent project that I've been doing is actually trying to look inside of these cables themselves. I don't know if you can see that. There are these very vague lines. This is actually a very nice picture, if I do say so myself. But yeah, there's actually like dozens of them, but you can see a couple of the lines. But the project that I've been more recently doing is trying to actually look inside of these cables themselves. And one of the things that largely populates what's going through these cables are images, right? But they're very different kinds of images in many cases than the kinds of images that we're used to being able to understand. So thinking about what's the relationship between sensing and automation, artificial intelligence, and images. And this is an example of the kind of images that I've been interested in lately. This is an example of what I call an invisible image, which sounds paradoxical, but what I mean by an invisible image is an image that one computer makes in order to be able to talk to another computer. So like visual communication among machines, but not for humans. And oftentimes that does happen through images. And this is an example of that translated back into an image that a human can see, which is kind of an image called an eigenface. And it's an image that's used in facial recognition software. So if I want to teach a computer how to recognize somebody's face, I need to have a couple of images of your face, and I need to understand what distinguishes your face from everybody else's in the world, right? And to do that, what I basically do is make a mathematical representation of what the average fingerprint of your face is. And then I get an average fingerprint of like an aggregate of any number of other people in the world. And I subtract the rest of the world's faces from your face to arrive at an idea of almost like a fingerprint of your face about what distinguishes you from everybody else's. And that kind of image, although it's not an image, it's it's a mathematical matrix, is called an eigenface. And if you translate that back into an image, you get something like this. So this is a portrait of Winona Ryder as a facial recognition software would see her. And we are kind of in the middle of this explosion of this kind of visual culture, a kind of visuality, an explosion of visuality that is really rivals and actually in many cases far exceeds the rise of mass culture in the mid 20th century with the reproducibility of images and the advent of mass media and so on and so forth. But this new version of visual culture and visuality is not for our eyes. It's largely invisible to us, and it is this kind of machine to machine vision. These are, I think I would go so far as to say that sitting here in 2017, the vast majority of images made in the world are made by machines for other machines, and humans aren't even in the loop, right? So we're talking about these post-anthropocentric forms of sensing or something like that. I don't want to get too philosophical about that, but we can think about that a little bit. But what that means then, one of the implications of that is that humans seeing images is actually the minority of things looking at images and making sense of them and doing things with them. So in this sense, these images have, the vast majority of visual culture has become invisible. And there's many examples of this, things like smart cities. In many cities, things like automatic license plate reading, there'll be cameras all over the city. All it will do is take a picture of every single car and automatically be able to read the license plate of that car and put the license plate, along with a timestamp and location stamp in a database. And in this way, like, accumulate these vast databases of the locations of cars. And then you can do things like if somebody's running a red light or taking an illegal turn, you can automatically issue traffic tickets to them. So this is one of the most basic forms of this automation of vision that I'm talking about. Other things like that are more, we would also relate to things like smart borders, where they're making borders where your face is basically your passport. Now they'll do facial recognition in airports. Self-driving cars, is all about automated vision. Having a vision system autonomously be able to navigate a city. Guided missiles and drones and that sort of thing are, the analogs of the self-driving car in warfare. Of course, they've been along in warfare much longer than they have been in the consumer sphere. This is built into manufacturing, quality control, logistics. If you have a factory and you're making, screwdrivers or something like that, you used to have to hire somebody and they had to pick up all the screwdrivers and make sure that they were, conform to the quality standards that you need. You don't do that anymore. You just have an automated system take a picture of every single one, and the vision system itself will automatically look for defects. We might know this in some of the most intimate part of our lives. This is also going on. If you noticed, if you put a picture of yourself on Facebook, or your friend's Facebook knows who you are and knows who your friends are and can kind of automatically tag everybody. And the reason for that is because over the years, Facebook has collected the greatest repository of images in the history of the world. And we have all conveniently told it who everybody is in all the images. And there's very powerful artificial intelligence on the backside of Facebook that we have all kind of collectively taught how to recognize basically everybody in the world. And Facebook can now recognize faces much more accurately than humans can. I can give Facebook a picture of me as a baby and it will recognize that it's me, but Boris wouldn't be able to do that by any stretch of the imagination. So the point is that some of these automated forms of seeing are much more quote unquote accurate even than the humans. So there's newer applications for this in recognizing objects, so it's not just being able to recognize faces. And when you upload an image to Facebook, it's not just looking at who you are and what your face is, it's looking at what the objects are in that. Do you like drinking Coke or Pepsi? It can analyze the architecture of the spaces that you're in and deduce the square footage and look at the objects that you have lying around, what you like to consume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, there's an enormous amount of what we might call metadata in everyday photographs that artificial intelligence algorithms are increasingly able to extract from them. Gestures. Um, Images are starting to make diagnoses, right? These are some things that are starting to come online now, where you take a picture of your dinner and it tells you what you're eating and how many calories are in it, and whether you should really eat something different or what have you. It's starting to make prescriptions, counting the amount of calories that you eat, tracking how much you exercise, and using this data to, again, make extremely intimate profiles of you. So kind of to sum up where we're at right now, we've arrived at a moment in history where most of the images made in the world are made by machines for other machines, where humans are not in the loop. And in fact, most of these images are invisible to humans. And this relationship between humans and images, we might say, has become inverted. And inverted in the sense that images used to be things that we would look at, but now images are actually things that look at us, right? Because they're able to extract data from about us from them. And so this, what we might think of a history of visual culture, which has been synonymous with a human viewer, has become the exception to the rule. And the rule itself is this kind of automated machine-to-machine forms of seeing. And they have, in a way, has developed its own visual culture. And this is the kind of thing that's going on in these cables at the bottom of the ocean. And so I think we might make a little bit of a detour about how machines see. You ask, like, so we have this world of automated vision. How does it actually work? And it goes back to the 1960s, actually 1959, and really two people who would probably be considered the pioneers of this field of automated vision or computer vision. A guy named David Hubel and another guy named Torsten Wiesel. And they kind of defined what I call how engineers think machines see, or how engineers think humans see. And what they did is a series of experiments on cats. Right? And what they did was they took a cat and they split open its skull and they attached electrodes to its brains. And this was in 1959. And what they wanted to answer, the question they wanted to answer was how does a cat see something, right? What's that relationship between the brains and the neurons in the brains and visual stimulus? And what they assumed would happen was that they would put a slide of a fish in front of a cat, and the cat's brains would light up and neurons would fire, because the cat would be very excited to see this fish and would want to eat and stuff like that. And what they realized very quickly was that that wasn't working. That they would put a picture of a fish in front of a cat and nothing would happen. The neurons would stay relatively inert that they were monitoring. And what they realized instead, what would happen was every time that they changed the slide, the neurons in the cat's brain would start firing. And so what they arrived at, the conclusion that they arrived at was that the cat was not seeing a fish in the first instance. What it was seeing was edges. Right? And the theory of vision that they arrived at was that meaning and being able to recognize things is based on very kind of crude constructions, a very crude relationship that your eyes has to your brain, which is based on really very primitive shapes, right? And that meaning is built up from really primitive shapes like edges and that sort of thing. And this was work that won the Nobel Prize in 1981. And this research kind of stayed stuck for a long time. There was some little progress in computer vision over the years, but there was really kind of an explosion that happened in the 1990s when computer vision algorithms got more robust for a number of reasons. Computer vision algorithms, they started being able to develop ones that would automatically look for regions of interest, shapes, edges, and one of the oldest forms of what we would now call artificial intelligence came from optical character recognition, this was research that was going on since the 1970s, and the trick was how do you put a text in front of a computer and translate that into you know, basically have machine readable text. Like if you want to write a check, you put it in the bank, you can just have the machine read the numbers off of you. And there was a huge advance in this that happened in 1998 when a guy named Jan LeCun developed a neural network that could learn how to read numbers and letters. And this was a really big step towards what we have now, which is a kind of explosion of um, these neural network-based approaches towards doing computer vision. So that you can, nowadays, you can do like gender recognition, emotion recognition. This is 70% disgusted. And you can take this further and further. And what happened in 2012 is we saw the advent of something called convolutional neural networks. And this was the beginning of what we now call deep learning. And there was two things that happened that enabled this kind of revolution to happen. First of all, it was that we saw the advent of what are called graphic processing units. And these were chips that were designed originally for video games so that you could play like Tomb Raider and that sort of thing. And they were very powerful graphics generators, basically. And what researchers realized is that you could use these chips for all kinds of other applications. And actually, it was SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that pioneered some of this. And in fact, they pioneered a lot of distributed computing. Um, but that was one thing that was new. The other thing, obviously, that was new was like microprocessors getting faster. The third part of this was that you could get access to data sets that you previously wouldn't be able to access. So for example, beginning in like the mid-aughts and late aughts, you could say, I want to have 2,000 pictures of an orange, and you could actually get 2,000 pictures of an orange relatively easily. So you could start building massive, massive data sets with millions and millions of images that you could then learn, that you could use to teach these artificial intelligence algorithms. And the way that these algorithms work is pretty interesting. They have their own kinds of ways of seeing. So when you create a neural network, these are like learning machines, right? And the way that you teach them is that you have to give them thousands and millions of images. And so you say, here's 10,000 pictures of an orange. Here's 10,000 pictures of a basketball. Here's 10,000 pictures of the sun, and so on and so on. And then you say, you computer, these are all these tagged images. You figure out what the difference between all of these objects is. And what the neural network will do internally is create images for itself that it will map to additional images that it sees to try to find correspondences. So one of those kinds of images that it makes internally is something that we've been calling a classifier. And this is an example of what that does. This is one for a candle. So what it will do is take all of the images of a candle that it's been taught, and it will put them all together. And it will figure out statistically what is an image of a candle look like. And it will go through every single pixel and say, like, well, most pictures of a candle, probably the outside is dark because usually candles are at night. So the outside of the frame, on the edges of the frame is going to be something dark. Probably in an image of a candle, the pixels in the middle are going to be brighter and they're going to have a certain kind of hue. And so you kind of build up the statistical representation of something that is most likely to be a candle and not something else, because again, like the faces, you have to subtract all of the other objects from that candle. So you have to figure out what is uniquely a candle. So this is a candle. This is a rose. And again, it's too bad that these images aren't easier to see because they're pretty weird. This is a shark. So what's kind of interesting here in terms of looking at these almost non-human forms of seeing is that these are images that to our eyes as humans, they look very abstract, right? But this is, as far as in artificial intelligence would be concerned, you literally could not make a more specific image of a shark than this. This is literally the most specific image that you could make. That's the whole point of it. And so you kind of see this gap, this kind of other way of being able to imagine seeing. And these are images that are even stranger. We can kind of come back to them there. We don't even have words for what these are, but these are, again, like primitive shapes that an AI will invent for itself to try to make sense of other images. This is a synthesized image of an apple. So we would take in the studio an AI and train it on, we have one training set that's Renaissance still life objects. So it's an AI that can recognize objects that are in Renaissance still lifes. And then we say, okay, well, draw me a picture of an apple, and this is what it came up with. And so this is the kind of thing that you use to do object recognition. And this is a fun little joke that we have kicking around the studio. This is not an apple, and the AI says, no, this is definitely a red and green apple. Now, I think all the stuff that I just told you, I think is bullshit. I think this is some bullshit that computer scientists invented to try to explain seeing. And the reason I say that is because all of the research in computer vision kind of ultimately goes down to this idea of chopping a cat's brains open and putting neurons in it. And that's the case study, right? So that's the model of vision on which this whole field is built, right? That the assumption is that you can isolate vision in that way. And I would say I don't really think that that is true. And I would say that the way that computers actually see is not in labs with electrodes attached to cats' brains, but in you. But I would argue that you cannot detach the technology itself from the institutions that deploy that technology for what ends, right? In the United States case, at least, the big industries that are driving this are the police, the military, and the market. Right? That's what it is. And so when we look at how these vision systems are actually implemented in real life, I think that you start this very different form of seeing emerges. So we've briefly looked at this idea of optical character recognition. This is something that's very easy to do now, and it's very easy to do very accurately. Now, when you get outside of labs, how is this being used? Well, I think that this is a very typical example, and in fact, this is a kind of one of the most widespread examples. This is a company called Vigilant Solutions. And this is a company that was formed in 2005. And it was a company that was formed to do license plate recognition. And so what their business model is very simple. They set up cameras around cities. They set up cameras on the backs of cars. And all they do is drive cars all over the country, and the cars take a picture of every license plate of every car and keeps a location record of it. Then they create these databases with billions and billions of images, and they will sell access to those images to police, to insurance companies, to private investigators, to anybody who wants access to location data of cars. Right? And the argument that they make is like, this is perfectly fine. This is all we're doing is driving around taking pictures, and that's true, right? But obviously, that's also not true at the same time. And recently, so this was how the company was formed, doing this for a number of years. More recently, in January 2016, Vigilant Solutions signed contracts with a handful of local governments in Texas. And these were some work that was done by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And what the company did was that they made a deal. They went to these local police departments and they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to give you free cameras, and you're going to put them on the back of all your police cars. And all of these cameras will, again, do this license plate recognition business. And what you're going to do is provide us access to your court records, right? And we see who has outstanding warrants, who has outstanding traffic tickets, and et cetera, et cetera. And so what happened was that the police could drive around the city, and if it recorded a license plate that had a warrant or a fine attached to it or something like that, or an arrest record, the police could immediately pull that person over. And the person would have two options. The police had a credit card reader, and they could say, okay, the person, you have to pay your fine right now, or you have to settle up whatever kind of financial problem you have with the government with this credit card reader, plus a $25 fee that goes to Vigilant Solutions as a service fee, or you get arrested. Right? So that's the choice that you have. And in addition to that, Vigilant Solutions gets to keep the records of all the license plates that the police collect, and goes into their massive database. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a kind of political operation going on here, and that political operation is very clear. The municipalities, again, the cities are incentivized to balance their budgets by deploying these kinds of technologies, and really kind of extracting money from what are ultimately going to be the most vulnerable people in that society. And so despite the fact that a computer science might tell you that these systems are objective, they're anything but. It's an example that in real life, they're only deployed as these kind of instruments of power, and it can't be otherwise. We fast forward to today, 2017, this was 2016, as we saw over the last few years, at least in the United States, there's been a lot of things about Black Lives Matter and people filming police killing people and that sort of things has been very controversial. And one of the solutions that some well-minded people have proposed is that police should wear body cameras, right? The police should always have cameras on and record all of the interactions that they make. Vigilant Solutions said, aha, there's a great opportunity here. What we're going to do is build facial recognition into all of the body cameras that those police will have to wear. And so now what we can do is we can enroll every face of every person that every police sees in police databases as well as Vigilant Solutions databases. And you can reproduce these kinds of things. In other words, taking this technology that some well-minded people thought would be a means of oversight, and it might be to a certain extent, but also weaponizing that at the same time. Some companies are taking this even further. There's a company in Israel that is claiming that just by doing an analysis of somebody's face, they can figure out if you're a terrorist or a white-collar criminal or a pedophile. Again, this is very disturbing stuff, a kind of neo-phrenology. This kind of thing has a very ugly history. And it's not just in this sphere of policing and military where this is happening. This is also happening in the kind of consumer sphere, right? So we're looking at a world in which your smartphone and all the pictures that you take is collecting information about you. And today, you put that information on Facebook and they want to sell you some shoes or what have you, right? But one of the rules of capitalism is that businesses always have to grow. And you're going to reach a limit of what I'm going to be able to advertise to you. So what are you going to use that data for tomorrow? Well, it's pretty easy to predict what you'll use that data for tomorrow if you're Facebook or Google or what have you. What I actually want to do is sell you insurance. What I actually want to do is modulate your credit rating. What I actually want to do is turn your life into a series of microtransactions. I want to bring every small, intimate detail of your life into the market somehow. Oh, you smoked a cigarette this evening. That's fine, but your health insurance is going to go up a little bit this month, that sort of thing, right? So we can imagine this kind of encroachment of capitalism into the further and further intimate, more intimate parts of our life. And woe to the teenagers today who put images like this of themselves on digital platforms that will never ever go away. So this question is, how do machines actually see? And this is really one of the main points that I want to get across today, is that machines don't see with edges. Machines see through the forms of power that they have been designed to replicate and reproduce and underline. Right? So machines don't see with edges, they see with forms of power. And I think that's a really kind of important thing to take away here. In counterpoint to that, how to see like a human. Now, there's a lot of things that I worry about with this increasing automation of vision. And obviously, I laid out a lot of them just now about policing and insurance and capital encroaching into more and more intimate parts of our lives. But I think there's perhaps a thing that I worry about more than that, which is something more fundamental, which is this, actually. So this is an interesting image to me in relation to machine vision. As we saw before, the AI decides this is an apple. But this image to me is Marguerite pointing to a certain kind of freedom, right? There's a freedom to be able, there's a freedom in the frangibility of images, right? That one of the ways that humans see is that we're continually creating meanings and recreating meanings and continually telling different stories about who we are, right? This is not an apple, this is a pipe. And so struggles over the meaning of images are always struggles over the meaning of common sense, like what common sense itself is. And that is also a struggle over self-representation. Right? And this can be a good thing. Meanings can change, and because meanings can change, it means that a society can evolve and perhaps become more just. Like every single social struggle, in the history of the humans has not only been a political struggle, but has been a struggle over images and a struggle over the meanings of those images, the struggle to define one's image vis-a-vis others. So when we see something like this actually scares me on a very fundamental level. And the reason why it scares me is because that you see this kind of automated insistence that this is what this image means. This is a red and green apple. And that here in the sphere of humans, we can't challenge this. Right? This is a system that is kind of being built to enforce a particular meaning of this image. And what I worry about in the very fundamental sense is perhaps the widespread deployment of these kinds of images or these kinds of object recognition systems deprives us of the ability to make meanings for ourselves and deprives us of the ability to create a more just world ultimately through the deployment of, through the modulation of meanings and through reinscribing images with different kinds of meanings. So to kind of come back to the ocean and to kind of sum up, if we think that if we gonna go along with Mahan for a minute, this idea that whoever controls the oceans controls the world, then perhaps we don't have to just think about the oceans in terms of navies and things like that being able to control the flow of goods, but thinking about who has control over the kinds of images that are flowing through these cables, and more importantly, who has control over the ways in which meanings are generated in the images flowing through the cables. Who has the power to use those images to do what? And that is something that I think all of us should think about a lot. And I guess that's really where I want to end it. Thank you so much for coming out. Just run through them all again. These are, we do the whole thing again. Let's start from the beginning. Or maybe we can start from the beginning. I don't know if this will, is that what this will do? Will this do that? There's a lot of images. Okay. Oh, these are the first ones of poking around underwater, and this is the British naval routes. I don't think we want to go through all the images. There's like 90 images or something like that. Very quickly. Okay, but just get rid of them. Okay, these are maps of NSA control. Okay, these are landing sites. I don't actually think my presentation flips very quickly. Landing sites off Hawaii. Hawaii is hugely important to this stuff. Marseille, going around underwater. These are the images that were the darker ones. Let's find these. Okay, yeah, this is a little bit more legible. You see this cable here on the ocean floor, and this one here in the bottom right. Fix one. Yeah, and this is one. This is off the west coast of Oahu, which is really one of the kind of major conjunctions of these things in the world. I think I'll just leave this image up. I think the other ones were kind of easy.
So first, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have basically two questions. First one is, as you said, this kind of automatized visuality is mostly used by the institutions of power, the police, and so on. I wanted to ask you if you see any way of using them subversively, of turning that around. That would be number one. And the second is, what effect do you think this is having and will have on human literacy? on written language,
Mm.
like because if the literacy is moving more and more towards images, what will be the status of the written word? Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Um, what can you re-articulate the first part of your question? Just very quickly. Be used against power. Yeah.
Can it also be used against
Yeah.
the institutions of power that
Yeah.
that control it right now?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I think that you can do fun things with it, and that's really in the studio what we're developing is we're developing very irrational data sets like based on dreams and monsters and things like that. And I think you can do stuff like that. Like you can play with this idea of what post-human vision might look like, or you can it can be a tool that can help you think in different ways about what that can defamiliarize vision, and I think that that is kind of fun as an exercise, and you can do some literary kind of things with that, I think. But I don't think that you can develop symmetrical power relationships to a Google or to a Facebook or something like that, simply because you have to have huge amounts of data to be able to do meaningful things with this at scale. And so there's a way in which the the architecture of the software itself has a kind of consolidation of power built into it, right? Because if you want to have the best facial recognition software in the world, you have to have all the images in the world, right? And so these things you actually can't separate them from one another. And so I don't have a lot of faith in political strategies that are going to somehow deturn or appropriate these tools at large scales. Right? The second part about the question of written language, I don't really know about that. I guess I don't really think about language as being written or visual. I guess for me these are always kind of mixed up with one another. I mean, I guess even when I'm reading a book, I'm making images of what I think are in the book, and so I think for a long time now it's been I just haven't thought about sense itself as being demarcated from like vision or sound or meaning. Like these things always seem kind of mixed up with me in this very squishy kind of human sensing apparatus that we have. Cool. So shall we have some beers? Oh, we did. Okay. I thought that was off the hook.
Not quite off the hook yet. I lived in the States at one point. I remember I used to drive from Texas to Louisiana, and when you crossed the state line in Louisiana, there were always the cops hanging around because the speed limit was much lower in Louisiana than in Texas. You sound very traumatized, and many of the concerns that you have about that quite disgusting company that you Vigilant Solutions. It's also related to the private prison industry in the States
absolutely.
and the capitalization of punishment. That seems to be a peculiarly American thing. How does your thinking tie in with the United States as a democracy and citizens in the United States and so on?
I guess it's a very American kind of framework that I'm bringing to this, and I think the reason for that is that the U.S. has traditionally much more than Europe embraced kind of extreme capitalism, kind of extreme neoliberalism, and really has not had the same kinds of institutions in place to protect things like data privacy and things like that Europe has been much better at. And so I think as a result of that, you get these case studies that kind of show you what forms of power become enhanced by technology that people would assume is neutral otherwise. And I think it's just with these kinds of case studies, it becomes very clear what forms of power are embedded within these systems, and how, and whose expense they're deployed at, right? So private prisons is a fantastic example. It's like taking something that Europeans would consider, this is very much a function of a civil society's running a prison and punishment that should not be left to, a capitalist organization. But when you do, that a lot of people make money from it, and that there's a kind of consolidation of political power that goes along with that, and that sort of thing, and it's ugly, as we know. But and I guess what I'm worried about is these kinds of systems deployed in a context where there is this kind of neoliberal ideology where capitalism and freedom itself are equated with one another. And this is very much a kind of Silicon Valley ideology. That what you actually end up with is very brutal, a very brutal and very violent society.
So what role does the privatization of money play in this? I'm thinking of bitcoins and all of this. I mean, you haven't talked at all, but somehow they must have a place in.
Yeah, this has been well, I wouldn't necessarily describe Bitcoin as the privatization of money so much as I would describe that cryptocurrency ideology is very much coming out of this weirdly American idea of freedom, like kind of the Old West, like we don't need a state, like the best, human freedom will be maximized by as little state, with the state having a smaller footprint on your life as possible, right? And that's a very kind of traditionally American ideology that has kind of been modulated in a way through Silicon Valley. Someone like Peter Thiel would be kind of like an archetype of this kind of ideology, and that's very present in that cryptocurrency kind of community, like in a very scary way, where they'll it's people in that world tend to be very who think about this stuff are very unapologetic about trying to create a form of hyper-capitalism, right? To create a system by which you can do these microtransactions at kind of huge scales that can be outside the purview of the state even, right? But sure, you can get rid of the state, but you still have the Google and you still have the Facebook. You have almost more of a feudal structure, if you want, whatever that
must all be connected. I mean, somebody who sort of sets up these systems, must sort of see how somehow in sort of a larger framework it can actually connect extremely well to Facebook and to.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's where this is going, and I think that's one of maybe the first generation of people that really believed in this cryptocurrencies is similar to the first, early internet people that, were writing these manifestos about, oh, this is going to create this new world and everybody will be able to talk to each other. And there's this kind of utopian instinct that has just no understanding of political economy, right? And I think that you see almost an exact recapitulation of that in the kind of cryptocurrency ideologies, as far as I can tell, but I'm not an expert on that. I think at best it's really naive, and at worst it really is, saying like, no, the human freedom will be maximized when when you can turn everything into a transaction. Right? I don't believe that.
And into debt.
I have one point to this, and also to this, like a possible counteraction. I'll be personal as just as a case. My profile on Facebook is my dog.
Yeah.
So when I ask, generators, who am I in like pop music of 1970s?
Right.
I'm James Brown. And at the 80s, I'm Michael Jackson, etc. Because it's Black Bulldog.
Yeah.
So somehow too, the positioning and distribution is a possible counteraction, and this very much goes to the crypto environment, which unfortunately, I mean, crypto environment is extremely cynical and depoliticized, like both anti-egoist and egoist environment. But anyhow, these channels, these tubes, we can all use them, If we know how to use them, we can all use them. Unfortunately, those who know how to use it, even like youngest generations, like I don't know, 4chan, anonymous cultures, and etc., are just horrible. But also in terms of intellectuals, there is a huge movement of apocryphal writing, anonymous writing, and etc., etc., etc. So I'm not pessimistic at
No,
all.
I totally agree with you. And there's all kinds of possibilities for hacking and disruption, and you can play with these things. I mean, these are stupid systems ultimately, right? And you can play with that, and you can laugh at it and be like, oh, this is stupid. It thinks I'm 100 years old or what have you. But that's not a strategy. And I guess that's the point that I'm making, is that you can do irrational things, but you're doing them on somebody else's turf, right? Somebody else owns the land that you're making those maneuvers on. And I guess that would just be the kind of the reason why I don't maybe have as much faith in that as one would want to have. Thank you guys so much.